Imagine standing in the forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, looking down at a shallow depression beneath the trees. It could be mistaken for an ordinary hollow, but beneath that soil are traces of something far older. People who came here thousands of years ago found copper inside ancient volcanic rock and began breaking the earth with tools made from stone. The strange part is not that copper was mined here. We know it was. The strange part is how early the mining began, how far the copper traveled, and how much of the original story disappeared before anyone wrote it down. Who mined America's copper first? How did they find the richest deposits? And why did 19th century miners sometimes discover that the ground they believed was untouched had already been worked long before their arrival? To answer those questions, we have to go back thousands of years. After the glaciers retreated from the Great Lakes, human communities moved through a changing landscape rich in fish, game, stone, and something far more unusual, naturally occurring copper. The Lake Superior region contained large deposits of native copper, metal that existed in relatively pure form rather than being locked inside complex ores. That mattered. A person did not need a furnace to extract copper from an ore. In some places, the metal could be found near the surface or embedded directly in rock. The landscape itself offered clues, and once people learned to recognize those clues, copper became a resource worth returning to. The earliest miners had no steel drills, no explosives, no engines. They had stone, wood, fire, and time. On Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula, archaeologists have documented ancient pits, hammerstones, and copper working evidence. The National Park Service describes prehistoric copper mining on Isle Royale extending back thousands of years, while research from the wider Lake Superior region points to major mining activity around 6,000 years ago. During the 19th century, explorers and miners encountered extensive prehistoric workings across Michigan's copper country. In some places, modern miners used ancient diggings as guides to copper deposits. Their search for industrial wealth sometimes disturbed or destroyed the very archaeological evidence they were trying to understand. They expected a frontier. Instead, they found a landscape with a mining history of its own. Then came the question that would change the story. How old were these workings? Early investigators tried to estimate their age from trees, soil, and abandoned pits. Later, radiocarbon dating provided a much stronger tool. Charcoal preserved in ancient mining contexts became a crucial clue. Research indicates that prehistoric copper mining in the Lake Superior region reached back thousands of years, with evidence of significant activity around 6,000 years ago. That means the story predates Rome, predates medieval Europe, predates the civilizations most people instinctively associate with ancient metallurgy. But there is an important correction to make. The evidence does not require a mysterious overseas civilization. It points toward indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region. Earlier theories sometimes imagine Phoenicians, Vikings, Europeans, or other distant peoples as the source of this technology. Archaeological research has found no convincing evidence for those claims. Instead, the old copper tradition is understood as an indigenous development rooted in the Great Lakes. So who mined America's copper first? The evidence points to indigenous communities living in and around the Great Lakes long before European contact. But answering that question creates another mystery. Who exactly were those first miners? On Isle Royale, more than 1,000 ancient mining pits have been identified. Yet the scale must be interpreted carefully. The National Park Service notes that this activity occurred over long periods and may have been connected to seasonal hunting, fishing, gathering, and other parts of indigenous lifeways rather than one centralized industrial operation. That distinction matters. The dramatic image of an ancient empire stripping Lake Superior of copper is not supported by the evidence. The reality may be more human. Generation after generation could return to productive places. A child learned where copper appeared. A worker learned which stone made an effective hammer. A community learned how to travel across the lake. Another generation learned how to shape the metal. Knowledge accumulated without ever being written in a book. And the copper itself traveled. Archaeological evidence shows Lake Superior copper appearing in objects far beyond the immediate mining districts, entering exchange networks that connected communities across the Great Lakes and beyond. So this was not simply a story of extraction. It was a story of knowledge, movement, trade, and adaptation. But eventually, the ancient mining traditions declined. Pits filled with soil, vegetation returned, communities changed, the copper remained. Thousands of years later, modern miners arrived. They drilled into the same hills. They followed the same copper-bearing ridges. And sometimes they were following traces left by people whose names had already disappeared. That creates one of the strangest reversals in American mining history. The modern industry believed it was opening a new chapter. In some places, it was reopening an old one. But one question remains almost impossible to answer. How much copper did the ancient miners remove? We know there was long-term extraction. We know copper objects traveled widely. We know that mining left thousands of pits and other traces. Modern research has even identified signatures of prehistoric mining in lake sediments, giving scientists another way to reconstruct when mining activity intensified. But the ancient miners left no production records, no inventory, no record of how many tons crossed the lake, and later industrial mining disturbs some of the archaeological evidence. That may be the most important lesson of the copper mystery. History does not become more fascinating when we invent answers. It becomes more fascinating when we discover how much can actually be recovered, and how much remains beyond our reach. Today, forests still cover many of these ancient landscapes. Lake Superior still surrounds Isle Royale. The rock still contains traces of a geological world more than 1 billion years old. And beneath the vegetation, old pits remain as physical reminders of people who worked here thousands of years before modern America existed. Stand beside one of those depressions and the scale of time becomes difficult to imagine. The miners are gone, their camps are gone, their voices are gone, but the scars remain. A stone hammer can survive when a name cannot. A fragment of charcoal can survive when an entire story disappears. A copper point can travel hundreds of miles and outlive the person who made it. And that is why the question, who mined America's copper first, has an answer that is both simpler and deeper than the mystery first suggests. They were indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes. They did not need a forgotten overseas civilization to teach them. They had their own landscapes, technologies, traditions, and thousands of years in which knowledge could develop. The real mystery is not who was there. The real mystery is how much of what they knew has vanished, how many techniques were never recorded, how many journeys across Lake Superior were never remembered, how many mines were abandoned before anyone outside those communities knew they existed, and how many stories disappeared before a written record could preserve them. Perhaps that is what makes the ancient copper mines so powerful. They are not monuments built to be remembered. They are traces left by ordinary people doing extraordinary work. People who entered the forest, found the metal, learned the rock, struck it with stone, carried it away, and then disappeared into the ordinary silence of history. The mines remain, the copper remains, the evidence remains, but the voices of the first miners are mostly gone. Perhaps the final mystery is not how they mined the copper. It is how much of their story was lost before anyone thought to write it down. So when you look at the ancient copper pits of Lake Superior, you are not looking at an impossible civilization. You are looking at something more real, and perhaps more remarkable. A record of indigenous ingenuity preserved in stone, soil, charcoal, and metal. A chapter of American history that began thousands of years before the United States existed. And one final question remains. How much more of that ancient history is still waiting beneath the forests, shorelines, and ground we walk across every day? If you enjoy documentaries about forgotten history, ancient engineering, archaeology, and mysteries investigated through real evidence, subscribe to The Last Cartographer. Because sometimes the most important discoveries are not the ones that give us an answer. They are the ones that teach us which questions are still worth asking.